That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the... We shall never surrender.
Chanter cet air palantin en arrivant au camp. Tous les petits poilus joyeux apprirent leur repas et bientôt tout régiment en donna gaiement. On n'ira pas en nage sur la Mississippi pour laver le linge, voici le moment.
Our story begins in 1918 with the humiliation of the once mighty German Empire. With the loss of the bulk of their army, the French situation was hopeless, and on June 22, 1940, an armistice was signed between the new French government and the now nearly victorious Third Reich. It was hoped by those in the higher-ups in Germany that the British would surrender shortly following the defeat of their largest ally. They were wrong. Shortly after the fall of France, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a fiery speech, announcing that the British people and their empire would never surrender. Some call this valiant, some call it foolish. I say it's irrelevant. The result is the same. But we will have to come back to the British, for the Führer of Germany's hunger for expansion in Lebensraum would not be satisfied with the simple conquest of France. His eyes turned to a much bigger prize, the endless expanse of Russia. He would invade the Soviet Union. But the question of when divided the German general staff. Hitler was set on an invasion in 1941, but some officers pleaded to wait one more year, to continue to reap the benefits of oil trade they had secured from the Soviets in 1939 and focus their air power in North Africa. After fierce debate, Erwin Rommel switched to the side of waiting and pled to Hitler. He believed that given one more year, he could secure North Africa and they could focus everything they had on the Soviets. Then, the Italians invaded Greece. After deciding to come to the Italians' aid by invading Yugoslavia, Hitler decided the Balkan campaign would make an invasion in 1941 a foolish endeavor, and so the invasion was postponed until 1942. And so we turn our eyes to the south, to the north of Africa. With sufficient air power, Rommel decisively broke Allied armies during the failed Operation Crusader. A blitz of German tanks were able to storm through Egypt. Despite the last stand of British, Indian, and Australian troops, the Suez was seized by the end of the year. Rommel had achieved his goal. The British Empire was split in two and further demoralized, and the experienced North African tanks and air forces were sent back to Europe for the coming invasion. But we'll have to save that for later. As for now, we turn to... The Japanese had been embroiled in a brutal war with China since 1937, and while Hitler starved for land, Japan starved for resources. The Americans had been the lifeline of Japanese imports, and following an oil embargo, Japan decided it needed to secure the future of its nation and strike south at the American and British holdings in the Pacific. However, the Japanese knew they couldn't take on the British and American fleets in their full capacity, and so it was decided. A preemptive strike on the Americans would need to be executed. On December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, 183 Imperial Japanese aircraft struck the American Navy based in Pearl Harbor. The planes, along with 5 Japanese subs which were repaired of their technical issues caught just weeks before, were in all able to sink 9 battleships, along with countless other cruisers, destroyers, and other vessels. The base's crucial naval repair yards were also struck after almost being overlooked by the Japanese Strategic Command. Thus began the battle in the Pacific. Hitler was just barely convinced to stick with the strategy of using 1941 to build up and withheld from declaring war on the United States. After a series of polls showed the American people did not favor war with Germany, Congress decided against going to war with the Reich, instead focusing fully on Japan. The war between these two naval powers would be decided in two decisive naval battles. First, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first clash of aircraft carriers between two powers. On the third day of the battle, after much confusion on both sides, the Americans were mistaken as to where they thought the Japanese fleet of two carriers was located. Meanwhile, the Japanese spotted the Americans and were locked onto their position. The following airstrike led to the sinking of both American carriers, the Lexington and Yorktown. It was over the next month that the Japanese planned for the next operation, the seizing of the island of Midway. However, it was discovered that the Americans had cracked the Japanese cipher and knew they were coming. If a major confrontation was inevitable, the Japanese would need some level of surprise. With the knowledge that the Americans were listening, misinformation as to the details of the attack were fed to American codebreakers. The following battle would be decisive in deciding the victor of the Pacific War. With Americans acting on false information, the Japanese were able to overwhelm the American fleet and sink the USS Hornet at the outset of the battle. Next went down the Enterprise. With only minor damages sustained on Japanese carriers, this victory ensured the continued advantage of the Japanese over the Americans. After days of bombardment, Midway finally surrendered to the Japanese. From this position, Hawaii would find itself under constant bombing. It is here that we return to Europe, where on June 11th, 1942, the largest land invasion of all time, a clash of European titans, would begin. It was a quiet morning in the still fields of Belarus. Valentin Aksenchuk tended to his small farm, miles out from the city of Bialystok. As he prepares to continue for his day, he listens to the faint sounds of nature around him, only to be interrupted by the ripping roar of German aircraft tearing through the sky above him. He watched in horror as the small village just barely visible from his property was hit with a volley of aerial bombardment, each explosion drowning out any sound of fleeing wildlife. Instead, deafening all who were so frozen by the sight they could not flee. No, all they could do was watch, as the greatest of the Reich's conquests, the conquest of Russia, began. Only watch, as the world as they knew it came to an end. The Soviets, taken by complete surprise, were broken in days. Soviet air power crippled almost instantly. Stalin went into complete shock and refused to leave his room. Meanwhile, encirclement after encirclement of thousands upon thousands of Soviet troops tore through the Russian ranks. Once Stalin finally came to terms with the reality and came out of his bedroom, he found himself completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of German troops marching from the west. The Air Force was destroyed with no hope of ever retaking the initiative in the air. As the weeks passed, the Germans only got closer and closer to Moscow. Its fall seemed imminent, and so Stalin himself ordered a diversion of northern army groups towards the defense of Moscow. And this did achieve what he had hoped. The Germans did not take Moscow in 1942. Instead, the weakened northern armies were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Leningrad was cut off and seized before the first snow fell. That winter, both sides dug in and prepared for the next year's offensive, the offensive that would prove too much for the Soviets to bear. As the snow melted, a massive German push stormed towards the Caucasus oil fields. Southern Soviet army groups had, like those in the north, been diverted to Moscow, where the Soviets thought the Germans would push for next. When it came down to it, the Soviet armies couldn't hold against the German forces. Stalingrad fell after heavy resistance, and after that, the Germans breezed to the Caspian Sea. For the duration of the summer, the Caucasus and their oil fields were seized. The German war machine had its fuel back. Finally, that fall, the German armies congregated at the center of the front and the battle for Moscow began. The battle would last weeks, with massive casualties on both sides as they fought tooth and nail. The fate of the world was at stake. But finally, after the near leveling of the city, the Germans were able to break the Soviet defenders and win the day. Stalin attempted to flee eastward, under cover in a civilian automobile. However, it was intercepted by German scouts. The Man of Steel met only lead that day. As the fleeing Soviet government descended into infighting from the power vacuum left from Stalin's death, the army collapsed into disorganization and mass surrender. Thus, the Reich's triumph had become absolute, and all of Europe fell under an axis of darkness.
Nous vivions tous les deux ensemble t'aimais, moi qui t'aimais. Belle vie séparée, ceux qui s'aiment tout doucement